Welcome to Sweet Dreams Storytelling, where we unwind, relax, and drift into dreamland. I'm your host, Mike, and I'm so glad you're joining me tonight. Let's get cozy and settle in. Story for this evening is our adaptation of a beautiful novel by Arthur Conan Doyle, The Lost World. Chapter 1, A Question of Courage. It began, as many life-altering quests do, with the burning desire to impress someone who scarcely noticed. Edward Malone, a junior reporter for the Daily Gazette, was in love. Gladys Hungerton was her name, beautiful, spirited, full of ideals, and utterly uninterested in the ordinary. To her, the world was vast and poetic, a place where great deeds mattered more than polite society or whispered promises over tea. She wanted a man of substance, a man of daring, a man who could write his legacy across the pages of history. And Edward, by contrast, had spent the last year covering flower shows and suburban crime. His days were a blur of typewriter clicks and soft headlines, and though he fancied himself a man of imagination, he had never had cause or courage to prove it. That evening, under a cloudy London sky, Edward found himself again on the narrow, lamplit path outside the Hungertons' townhouse. The iron gate creaked when he opened it. Gladys was in the parlour, bathed in soft golden light and half turned toward the window, reading from The Voyage of the Beagle. When she looked up, her smile was polite. Not warm, not cold, just polite. "Edward," she said, folding the book with deliberate care. What a surprise. He had rehearsed 100 lines. This was not how he'd imagined the scene. "I came to speak plainly, Gladys. I hoped you might already know." Her eyebrows arched, amused, curious. "Know what, Mr. Malone?" "That I love you," he blurted out. "That I would do anything, be anything, if it meant being worthy of you." Gladys stood. The air seemed to tense around them. She walked slowly to the window, her back to him now. "I have no doubt that you are sincere," she said at last. "But sincerity is not enough." He frowned. "What more is there?" "Courage," she said, turning back to him. "Not the courage of polite conversation or facing a rude editor. I mean real courage. A man must do something extraordinary to matter in this world." Edward tried to speak, but she raised her hand. "I cannot love a man whose life will pass unnoticed, Edward. I need someone who lives boldly, who challenges fate, who proves his mettle against the unknown." "You want someone heroic," he murmured. "I want someone unforgettable," she replied. It struck him then, not as a rejection, but a challenge. Later that night, he sat alone in his tiny flat, her words echoing through the silence. He looked at the framed clippings on the wall, his carefully curated career. A lost dog returned, a stolen bicycle recovered, a school bake sale. It was not the resume of a bold man, not yet. He reached for his notebook, the one he used for serious stories, and wrote a single question across the first page. "What must I do to be unforgettable?" That question led him, the next morning, to the desk of his editor, Mr. McArdle. "You want a dangerous assignment?" McArdle asked, blinking over his spectacles. "What sip's this about, Malone? You trying to get yourself killed?" "I'm trying to get noticed," Edward said, "preferably by a woman, but I settle for the front page." McArdle leaned back, eyeing him skeptically. Then he chuckled. "You're in luck. There's a lunatic professor, Challenger's his name, who claims he's found living dinosaurs in South America. Everyone thinks he's a fraud, but he's ready to punch anyone who says it to his face. Go interview him, Malone, and try not to get strangled." Malone blinked. "Dinosaurs?" "Yes," McArdle said with a wave. "The man's sip's a menace, big beard, bigger temper. But if you stir looking for danger, his sip'll give you your chance." And just like that, Edward Malone stepped into a story bigger than anything he had ever imagined. He didn't yet know where it would lead. Jungles, monsters, discoveries that would shake the scientific world. But he walked away from the newsroom with purpose. Because somewhere, far from the safety of his city life, there was a place still waiting to be found. And he would find it. For courage. For glory. For her. Chapter 2, The Mad Professor. The name Professor Challenger was spoken in the halls of journalism like a warning or a joke, depending on who told the story. A man of immense intellect, volatile temper, and a size that seemed better suited to a Viking than a scientist. Challenger had made enemies in every corner of academia. Some said he had once thrown a geologist through a window. Others claimed he had bitten a zoologist at a symposium. Everyone agreed on one thing: you did not interrupt Professor Challenger. That, of course, was precisely what Edward Malone intended to do. At 10 minutes past noon, Malone arrived at the professor's residence on Enmore Park, a stout brick home with ivy-choked eaves and windows that glared out like suspicious eyes. The brass knocker on the door was shaped like a snarling lion's head. He hesitated a moment before lifting it. Knock, knock, knock. The door opened a crack, and an eye appeared in the gap. Yes? Edward Malone, Daily Gazette. Have come to speak with Professor Challenger. There was a grunt. The eye vanished. Then the door creaked open, just wide enough to admit him. The hallway was dark and smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper. Malone followed the butler's silent gesture into a study filled wall to wall with books, skulls, preserved specimens, and brass instruments whose purposes he couldn't guess. It was equal parts museum, laboratory, and war room. And there, seated like a king at the center of it all, was the man himself. Professor George Edward Challenger. He was a barrel-chested giant with a thick black beard that bristled in every direction, as though his fury had somehow extended to his follicles. His hands were like shovels. His eyes gleamed with suspicion even before he spoke. "So," Challenger said, "another reporter sent to mock me." Malone opened his mouth, but Challenger stood up abruptly, towering over him. "Let me guess. You want me to repeat my account so your little newspaper can run another cartoon of me fighting a stegosaurus in my underpants?" "I assure you," Malone said, voice even but firm, "I came here because I believe your claims deserve to be heard." Had Challenger barked, advancing like a bear. Do you? Do you really? Or do you simply want a story big enough to justify your miserable position in the third column of the fourth page?" "Maybe," Malone admitted. "But maybe I want more than that. Maybe I want to see it with my own eyes." That gave Challenger pause. "You are a braver fool than most," he muttered, stepping back to his chair. "Sit down then. If I smell dishonesty, I shall throw you out the window. Second floor, I sep done it before." Malone sat. "You, Civ, read my report." "Yes," Malone replied. "As Dev read it, but I want to understand what you saw, not what the journals mocked." Challenger gave a low, suspicious hum. "It was 2 years ago, a forgotten corner of the Amazon basin, dense rainforest, uncharted plateaus, unscalable cliffs. My guide fled after the second week. I pressed on, and there atop an isolated plateau, I saw creatures that should have been dust for 100 million years." Malone said nothing. He let the silence stretch, inviting more. "They were not fossils," Challenger continued. "They were alive, breathing, moving. I saw a pterodactyl take flight with my own eyes. I collected sketches, samples, and photographs," Malone asked gently. Challenger scowled. "The camera was crushed during our descent, and since returning, the scientific community has done nothing but ridicule me. Sent a fraud to them, a fantasist." He leaned forward. "But I will return, and this time I will bring witnesses. Men of science, men of words, men like you." Malone blinked. "You want me to join you?" "I want someone foolish enough to believe, brave enough to go, and clever enough to survive. Do you meet those criteria, Mr. Malone?" Edward didn't hesitate. "I believe I do." Challenger grunted. "Then prepare yourself. We leave within the month. ISEP already secured backing for an expedition, and I have the names of those I intend to bring. You will not be the only one." Malone's heart pounded. This was it. The real story, the kind of story that rewrote careers and lives. "One question," he said, standing. "Speak it. If what you say is true, why aren't you famous already?" Challenger rose too, his expression suddenly sober. "Because the world doesn't reward truth, Mr. Malone. It rewards what is safe, what is simple. But when we return, they will have no choice but to believe." As Malone left the study and stepped back into the foggy London afternoon, he felt both exhilarated and unsettled. He had come in search of a story. He had found a revolution. Chapter 3: The Public Debate. A week after his stormy encounter with Professor Challenger, Edward Malone sat in the crowded, echoing lecture hall of the Zoological Institute, where the future of science and perhaps history was about to be decided. The letter had come sealed in red wax, hand-delivered to Malone's office by a nervous boy who refused to make eye contact. It bore no return address, just a single slanted signature at the bottom of the envelope, Challenger. Inside, the message was short, but dramatic. Mr. Malone, you are hereby invited to witness a reckoning. Zoological Institute Hall, Thursday at 8 p.m. Come prepared to see the scientific world tremble. EEC. Malone, ever the journalist, now emboldened by something deeper, a stirring in his blood, arrived early. Already the great hall was buzzing with speculation. Academics, skeptics, reporters, and socialites jostled for space in the arched room, with its domed ceiling and tiered rows. A storm was coming, but it wouldn't bring rain, it would bring scandal. He recognized several faces from the Gazette and nodded politely. Most were there to enjoy the fireworks. Challenger had made enemies across every scientific society in London, and they'd come prepared to feast on his humiliation. But Malone wasn't so sure that humiliation was what lay ahead. The hall fell silent as the moderator took the stage, a thin, pale man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the look of someone who disliked confrontation and deeply regretted his current position. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice echoing, "we are gathered this evening to discuss the recent claims made by Professor George Edward Challenger concerning the discovery of living prehistoric species in the Amazon basin." A murmur of amusement rippled through the crowd. "We are not here," the moderator continued stiffly, "to ridicule. We are here to hear both sides of the debate and to determine whether further inquiry is merited." He stepped aside. And then came Challenger. He entered not like a guest, but like a conqueror, his chest puffed beneath a dark wool coat, beard blazing like a lion's mane, and eyes sweeping the crowd with open disdain. A hush fell as he climbed to the lectern and stood alone beneath the gaslight chandelier. "If any among you are here to sneer," he growled, "I suggest you find the door before I help you through it. I will not be jeered at by lice in waistcoats." There were scattered chuckles, but no one left. "I will not waste time restating what I have seen," Challenger continued. "Those with the capacity to listen may read my report. Those who prefer mockery may enjoy their ignorance. But I offer you this a chance to witness it yourselves." The room stirred. People leaned forward. "I will mount a second expedition. I will return to the plateau. But this time, I will bring witnesses. Scientists, journalists, skeptics. Let your best minds come with me. Let them see, and let the world decide." It was a gauntlet, hurled with force. A voice rang out from the back. "And who will verify your claims this time, Professor? Your pet iguana?" Laughter erupted. Professor Challenger sits, hand shot up, and so did his temper. "Let the coward who said that stand and name himself." A short man with wiry hair and sharp eyes rose to his feet. "Professor Summerlee, Royal Zoological Society. And yes, I called your claims absurd, because they are." The hall grew suddenly electric. Challenger stared down at him, eyes narrowed. "Then come with me, Summerlee. Debate me not from your lecture hall, but from the jungle floor." Summerlee gave a theatrical shrug. "Gladly, if only to expose you for the charlatan you are." The crowd roared in appreciation. The moderator tried in vain to quiet them. Malone leaned forward in his seat, heart hammering. A war was forming, not with bullets, but with discovery and pride. The moderator took the stage again. "Then it is settled. A committee of observers will be formed. An expedition will proceed under joint supervision. The Royal Zoological Society will select its representative. Professor Challenger shall lead. Are there others who wish to go?" Before he could second-guess it, Malone stood. "I do." Heads turned. Challenger's eyes met his, and something like a smirk tugged at the corner of his beard. "And who are you, sir?" called someone from the crowd. "Edward Malone, journalist, Daily Gazette." Laughter again, dismissive this time. "A reporter," Summerlee scoffed. Challenger, however, raised a hand. "No," he said, "not just a reporter, a man who wants to see the truth. And that, gentlemen, is rarer than you think." The crowd, now fully stirred, murmured with anticipation. An expedition, an adventure, was truly happening. As the meeting broke and conversations turned into argument, Malone slipped out into the cool London night, dazed and electrified. He had not only committed to the journey, he had just made it very public. There was no turning back now. And somewhere deep in the Amazon, beyond maps and memory, Something ancient waited to be found. Chapter 4. The team assembles. The morning after the debate at the Zoological Institute, London's newspapers exploded with headlines. Some mocked, some marveled, but all paid attention. Dinosaurs in the Amazon, Challenger to lead expedition into the unknown. Professor Summerlee joins to debunk claims. Young reporter volunteers as witness. Edward Malone's name was printed for the first time, not in the back pages, but on the front. Yet instead of basking in it, he sat in the newsroom with a map of South America spread across his desk and a list of supplies scribbled into the margins. He wasn't preparing an article, he was preparing for the jungle. McArdle, his editor, hovered nearby like an anxious hawk. "You've made quite a show of yourself, Malone," he muttered, arms crossed. "What if this whole thing sex a farce? What if that madman gets you killed chasing lizards and ghost stories? Then you'll have the most exciting obituary the Gazette ever printed," Malone replied without looking up. McArdle snorted, but there was something close to pride in his eyes. "Well, if you're going to die, at least do it with style and bring back something no one can deny. Proof, Malone, not pretty prose, proof." By the week's end, the expedition party had begun to take shape. Professor Challenger called for a private meeting at the Royal Geographical Society, this time in a secure invitation-only room, far from the peanut gallery of London skeptics. Malone arrived early and found himself seated in a walnut-paneled study surrounded by maps, trophies, and leather-bound volumes that smelled of pipe smoke and empire. Challenger entered first, his heavy boots booming like war drums across the floor. Summerlee followed soon after, muttering under his breath and shuffling papers as if they might shield him from the coming insanity. The final member of the party arrived last, a tall man with sun-darkened skin, broad shoulders, and the unmistakable swagger of someone accustomed to danger. Lord John Roxton. Malone recognized him immediately. A famous hunter, explorer, and soldier of fortune. His reputation preceded him. Rumors of jungle warfare, of tribal diplomacy, of vanished expeditions brought home under his command. If anyone could survive the unknown, it was Roxton. "Gentlemen," Roxton said, taking off his hat and nodding slightly. "I hear there sips something worth shooting at the end of this particular rainbow." Challenger's eyes glinted. "Possibly the biggest game on Earth, or perhaps a hoax of magnificent scale. Either way, you'll get your adventure." Summerlee grunted, "Or your obituary." Roxton grinned. "Let six hope it's six, not both." Challenger wasted no time. He unfurled a large map onto the table. A red circle marked a dense, mostly unmapped region of the Amazon basin in southern Venezuela. "Here," he said, "we travel by steamer to Para, then upriver by canoe to the headwaters of the Tapirapay. From there we trek inland to the plateau." "The plateau, you say, contains living dinosaurs," Summerlee added with a raised brow. "Yes," Challenger snapped, "an evidence you can no longer dismiss once you seen it with your own eyes. I assume you have brought your equipment, Summerlee. Microscope, sample kits, comfortable boots." "I packed twice what I need," Summerlee said, "in case you lose yours again." Malone scribbled notes furiously, his head spun with thoughts of what lay ahead: days of river travel, weeks of jungle, the oppressive heat, the insects, the threat of sickness, wild animals, and whatever else might truly exist on that plateau. But he also felt a strange calm. He had no illusions now. He wasn't simply chasing Gladys's approval anymore. This had become his quest. That evening, Roxton invited Malone to his club, a vaulted room filled with mounted heads and thick cigar smoke. They sat beside a fireplace with tumblers of brandy. "So, you stir the penman," Roxton said, studying him. "You ever fired a gun, Malone?" Malone hesitated. "Only at a carnival." Roxton chuckled. "Then keep close to me in the jungle." Malone looked up. "Do you believe Challenger?" Roxton paused, then swirled his glass. "I seen things in the bush. I wouldn't dare describe in public, and I feared men who mocked what they did instead understand. I don't know what we find, but I believe something's waiting for us out there, something big." Malone nodded, his fingers tightened around the glass. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but he felt a new weight settle on him, the kind of weight one feels before stepping into the unknown. There would be no easy path back, no quiet retreat. The team was assembled. The course was set. Ahead lay the jungle, and beyond that, a world forgotten by time. Chapter 5. Into the Amazon. The journey began not with a roar, but with a rattle, the rattle of wheels on stone, trunks loaded into carriages, and the murmured farewells of those left behind. There were no crowds waving flags or bands playing marches, just 4 men boarding a ship, quietly, early in the morning, bound for South America and whatever waited beyond civilization's edge. From the port of Southampton, they sailed aboard the SS Esmeralda, a trim vessel bound for the Brazilian coast. Edward Malone stood at the rail as England faded into fog, knowing it might be the last time he saw its familiar shoreline. The sea stretched out before him, blue and endless, as if daring him to look back. He didn't yet. 2 weeks later, the Esmeralda docked in the sweltering heat of Para, a tangled port city where the jungle met the Atlantic in a tangle of ships, markets, and shouting voices in half a dozen languages. Para was alive with chaos, sweating porters, hauling crates of bananas and rubber, barefoot children darting through the docks, and merchants hawking everything from machetes to monkey skulls. The air smelled of salt, fruit, and engine oil. To Malone, it was thrilling. To Challenger, it was merely an obstacle. We load by dusk and set off by dawn, he barked to the hired crew, gesturing toward the crates of gear. 5 canoes, waterproofed stores, rifles, rations for 6 weeks. No delays. This is not a pleasure cruise. Summerlee muttered something about heatstroke and took refuge under a parasol, already crimson from the sun. Roxton, on the other hand, looked entirely at home, trading jokes with the local guides, checking the weight of his hunting rifle, and whistling as if they were going fox hunting in Surrey rather than venturing into uncharted wilderness. Malone tried to keep up. Their local expedition team consisted of a dozen native porters and 2 guides. Zambo, a tall, strong half-Indian, half-African man with a proud demeanor and quiet intelligence, and Gomez, a wiry Brazilian with quick hands and eyes that flicked everywhere at once. They loaded the canoes with care, wrapping supplies in oiled canvas and testing each hull for leaks. The rifles, Lee Enfield carbines, were packed last, oiled and ready. They would need them. By the 2nd day upriver, the Amazon had swallowed them. The great brown serpent of water stretched on endlessly, coiling between walls of green that seemed to lean inward like a living corridor. Howler monkeys barked in the trees. Macaws screeched overhead. The jungle pulsed with life, colorful, deafening, and unknown. Days passed in a strange rhythm. Paddle, eat, paddle, sleep. Mosquitoes bit through sleeves. Liches appeared on ankles. Rain fell without warning and vanished just as quickly. Sometimes they passed tiny villages where curious children stared silently and dogs barked at their approach. Other times, there was only water, trees, and silence. At night, they made camp on sandbars or clearings. Challenger reviewed his maps by firelight, poring over every elevation line as if it held a secret. Summerlee tried to catalogue every plant and insect, his notebooks growing heavy with sketches and complaints. Roxton cleaned his rifle and told stories of jaguar hunts and near misses in Borneo, and Malone listened. More than once, he asked himself, "What am I doing here?" He missed the smell of newsprint, the clack of typewriters, the steady thrum of London, and yet he also felt something he'd never known before: freedom, purpose, a sense that the world was more than headlines and deadlines. On the 9th day, the river narrowed and the trees grew denser. The Taparapa forked into a smaller tributary, shallow and twisting. It was there, late in the afternoon, that they saw something that stopped them all cold. A great tree near the water's edge had been toppled, not by axe or age, but by brute force. The bark was gouged with deep scratches, 4 long slashes, spaced evenly, too large for a jaguar or any known cat. Roxton crouched beside the marks. "These weren't sit made by anything we sit classified," he said. "At least, nothing that walks this continent." Challenger said nothing. He simply smiled. Summerlee adjusted his glasses. Or perhaps this is just the result of erosion and imagination. Malone said nothing, but he shivered. That night, the jungle was louder than usual. Cracks in the undergrowth, a splash that echoed too loudly, the growl of something large. Zambo didn't sleep, neither did Roxton. The next morning, as they rounded a bend, they saw it. The plateau. It rose from the forest like the bones of the world. sheer cliffs of red rock covered in vines, with clouds clinging to the rim. It looked impossible, impassable, unnatural. Challenger stood, hands on hips, triumphant. "There," he said, "the lost world." Malone stared up at it, his throat dry. They had arrived at the edge of something beyond imagination, but they were still far from entering it. Chapter 6. The Plateau. There it stood. A red-walled monolith rising hundreds of feet above the jungle canopy, flat-topped and impossibly broad. The cliffs glowed in the late morning sun, streaked with black lichen and shadowed by overhanging ledges. Clouds drifted lazily along its summit like smoke from a sleeping giant. The very sight of it silenced the entire expedition. "The plateau," Challenger whispered, as if speaking too loudly might wake it. They were days deep into the jungle now, far beyond any known trail. No other humans had passed here in generations. If ever, the air was thick with heat and tension. Parrots screeched in the distance, and a faint wind stirred the broad leaves overhead, but otherwise the world felt unnaturally still. Malone, sweating through his shirt and boots soaked from a recent swamp crossing, lowered his field glasses and swallowed. "It doesn't look climbable." "It isn't set," Roxton replied. "Not from this side. Sheer drop for 1,000 feet. Challenger turned to Gomez, their native guide. "You said there was a narrow approach. A rock shelf. Where is it?" Gomez gestured northward, around the far side. 3, maybe 4 miles. But difficult, very steep, dangerous. Challenger smiled. "Perfect." The hike around the base of the plateau took 2 days. The jungle grew thicker, more hostile. Vines tangled at their feet. Thorned brush shredded sleeves and drew blood. One of the porters narrowly avoided a snake bite. Roxton shot the serpent clean through the eye, not even pausing his stride. On the second night, they camped near a waterfall that cascaded from the heights above, vanishing into a misty pool below. Its constant roar masked every sound, leaving them all slightly on edge. Summerlee complained of jungle fever and treated himself with quinine and sarcasm in equal measure. Zambo remained quiet, watchful. Malone noticed he often looked toward the cliffs at night. "What do you see?" Malone asked him once by the fire. Zambo shook his head. "I hear things. In the dark. Big things." Malone didn't ask again. On the morning of the 3rd day, they found it. The pathway, barely more than a crumbling ledge. It snaked upward along the eastern face of the plateau, winding back and forth in tight switchbacks. Vines dangled down the rock face like ropes. Buzzards circled overhead. The air grew thinner and cooler as they climbed, and every step felt like a step out of the world they knew. The porters refused to follow. "We wait here," Zambo said, setting down their final crates near the base. "We watch. We protect camp, but we don't go up." Challenger didn't argue. Neither did Roxton. Each man carried only the essentials: food, water, rifles, notebooks, and each wore a climbing harness improvised from rope and canvas belts. Malone had never climbed anything taller than his boarding school roof, but now he clung to sun-warmed stone, gripping handholds and praying each foothold didn't crumble beneath his boot. Halfway up, he looked down. The jungle sprawled endlessly below, a living ocean of green. He had never felt so small. He looked up. The top still seemed impossibly far. "Don't stop," Roxton called from above. "If you pause, you lose your nerve." Malone gritted his teeth and pressed on. By noon, they reached a narrow ledge barely wide enough for 4 men to sit side by side. Above them was the final ascent, a sloped ridge of broken stone leading to the summit, accessible by a natural stone bridge. They crossed it single file, Roxton first, Challenger next, Summerlee after, and Malone last. The stone bridge was barely 6 feet wide and spanned a yawning drop that seemed to have no bottom. A single misstep meant death. When they reached the far side, they stood, panting and stunned. The summit of the plateau spread before them like another world. The air was strange, lighter, filled with a different set of smells: wet moss, heavy flowers, something vaguely sulfuric. Trees taller than any they'd seen below grew in twisted patterns. Ferns the size of men fanned out like parasols. Vines hung in thick curtains from massive trees. It was lush, vibrant, and oddly silent. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, just wind and the distant croak of something too deep to be a frog. Summerlee stepped forward, wide-eyed. "Good Lord," he said. "It sits untouched, entirely untouched." Challenger sits, beard bristled with triumph. "I told you," he whispered. "We are not trespassing on jungle. We are stepping into prehistory." Malone took out his notebook, hands trembling. He wrote just one word on the first page. Arrived. As they explored the edge of the plateau, Roxton made a grim discovery. The stone bridge, the only obvious way back, was dangerously unstable. A crack ran through the center of it, hidden beneath moss and dirt. "It scents rotting from within," Roxton said. "One good tremor or a bit of weight in the wrong spot, and its cell give way." Challenger waved it off. We'll worry about descent later. For now we map, we document, we discover." Malone stared at the bridge, then at the wild expanse behind them. They had climbed to the top of the world. They had crossed into a place untouched by time, and they had no clear way back. Chapter 7. Cut Off. The first night atop the plateau was uneasily quiet. Their camp was a small, makeshift circle of canvas and ropes, perched just inside the tree line. A fire crackled at its center, casting flickering shadows across the leaves. Each man kept a rifle within arm's reach, though no one quite knew what threat they were guarding against. The jungle here didn't sound like the one below. It didn't sound like anything they knew. The chirps and cries of common birds and insects were replaced by long, low moans and occasional guttural bellows from somewhere deep in the trees, echoes of creatures whose shapes and habits were unknown. "I don't suck like this silence," Roxton muttered, inspecting his rifle for the third time that evening. "The jungle always talks, but this feels like something listening." "It sets not silence," Malone said quietly. "It sets restraint." Challenger, meanwhile, was positively glowing with excitement, pacing the perimeter like a proud host showing off his estate. "This is it, gentlemen. A land preserved in amber, a prehistoric ark, isolated for millions of years, and we are the first men to set foot on it since the dawn of time." Summerlee frowned. "It sits not an achievement yet. It sits an observation. Let's see a dinosaur before we call it science." The next morning dawned with dense fog rolling over the plateau, making every tree and rock seem ghost-like and unfamiliar. The explorers wasted no time. Roxton and Malone scouted east, Challenger and Summerlee west, marking trees and sketching the terrain. They found peculiar signs: trees with huge shredded leaves, claw-like impressions in the soft soil, and enormous piles of dung, unlike any droppings they had ever studied. But no direct sightings. The plateau remained mysterious. Just before noon, a thunderous noise cracked through the forest. It was not thunder. It was sharper, louder, closer. The men dropped what they were doing and ran back toward camp. Zambo Sip's voice echoed from far below the cliff. "Mr. Malone, Mr. Malone, something Sep's wrong." Panting, Malone rushed to the edge, followed by the others. Far below on the jungle floor, Zambo stood waving his arms frantically beside the supply camp. But he wasn't alone. One of the porters, frightened and pale, pointed upward toward the cliff wall. Then they saw it. The stone bridge, their only way back down, was gone. Where once a narrow but solid shelf had connected the ridge to the outer cliff, now there was nothing but a sheer drop and a misty void. The bridge had collapsed. No, not collapsed. Cut. Chunks of stone still jutted out from either side, as if it had been deliberately broken. A closer look revealed marks along the break, tool marks, smashed edges, shattered rock. "It didn't fall," Roxton growled. "It was destroyed." Summerlee leaned dangerously close to the edge. But by whom? Why? Malone felt his stomach twist. The guides, Gomez. Roxton Best's face darkened. "Gomez was standing at the rear when we crossed. He was slow, kept looking over the edge." "Sabotage," Challenger muttered, fists clenched. "To strand us." Zambo called up again, voice urgent but distant. "We stay, we wait. You tell us what to do." "Good man," Roxton shouted down. "Stay there, guard the camp, watch the trees, and for God's sake, keep Gomez in sight." "I don't see Gomez," Zambo cried. That made the silence feel heavier. They returned to the plateau, their mood grim. The realization had settled like cold iron in the gut. They were trapped. 4 men, stranded atop an uncharted prehistoric island, with no clear route down and no way to call for help. The jungle below was days away from any settlement. The plateau, by all appearances, was inaccessible from every side. Summerlee paced furiously. We should have set ropes, left a signal, something. We planned for exploration, not betrayal, Malone said. Roxton was already calculating. We save enough food for 2 weeks if we ration it. Fresh water is here. Fresh water is here. We can hunt. We can last. But can we leave? Summerlee asked. Challenger, unshaken, looked out toward the distant trees with the glint of a man who still saw this as triumph. We still find another way, he said. There must be a descent somewhere else along the ridge, a tunnel, a slope, a path forgotten by time. Roxton gave him a sideways glance, or we never leave at all. Challenger turned to the group, voice steady. We will leave, and we will bring the world with us. But first, we must survive. Malone looked out over the vast ancient jungle that stretched across the plateau like a dream. The air buzzed with unseen life. Somewhere out there were answers, and possibly monsters. They were no longer just explorers. They were castaways in a lost world. Chapter 8. First Contact. 3 days passed. 3 days of cautious exploration, uneasy rationing, and constant vigilance. The reality of their situation had settled into their bones, stranded atop a prehistoric island in the sky, surrounded by a jungle older than mankind. But it wasn't the isolation that unnerved Malone. It was the growing sense that they were not alone. The plateau was vast, miles wide and thick with towering ferns, colossal trees, and thick underbrush that made progress slow and dangerous. Every sound, every cracked branch, every fluttering leaf felt like it might belong to something watching them, following them. Roxton led their daily scouting parties with calm efficiency. Challenger documented everything with near-manic focus. Summerlee lagged behind to sketch unfamiliar plant specimens. Malone kept his rifle close and his eyes open. It was on the 4th morning that they found it. A footprint. Not the print of a human, not a paw, something reptilian. 3 toes, each the size of a man's boot, sunken deep into the muddy riverbank at the edge of a shallow stream. The footprint was unmistakably fresh. Roxton crouched beside it. Whatever made this walked through here not long ago, last night, maybe this morning. It's Sep's not a hoax, Malone whispered. It can Set be. Challenger grinned, wild-eyed. Proof, living proof. Summerlee looked pale. If it sits alive, where is it now? They moved cautiously, following the trail into a clearing bordered by dense ferns. Something had moved through the brush, knocking over saplings and scraping bark from trees 10 feet off the ground. And then without warning the jungle parted, and they saw it. It stood on 2 thick legs, balanced like a bird, with a long tail stretched behind it for balance. Its body was covered in leathery, scale-like skin the color of moss and clay. Atop its short neck, a blunt snout sniffed the air, and small eyes blinked slowly in the sunlight. An iguanodon. It was real. It existed, and it was grazing like a cow in a meadow that time had forgotten. Malone felt his heart stop. He reached slowly for his notebook, but his hands trembled too badly to write. The creature, easily 25 feet long, paid them no mind as it fed on low-hanging leaves. Another emerged behind it, then a third. A herd. Challenger stepped forward, his voice a whisper laced with awe. You see, Summerlee, you see. Summerlee said nothing. He simply stared, overcome. Roxton held up a hand. Don't sit, move. Don't sit, speak, just watch. For 10 glorious minutes, the group observed the creatures in silence, sketching, filming with Challenger's hand-cranked cine camera, recording everything. The iguanodons, sluggish and passive, made no aggressive movement. They resembled great dumb cattle more than monsters. Their presence was overwhelming not for its threat, but for its impossibility. And then something changed. A sudden crash in the brush. The iguanodons froze, then bolted, lumbering with surprising speed into the trees. Roxton had already raised his rifle. Something spooked them. Challenger shook his head. Nothing could frighten a full-grown iguanon, not unless... The words stopped in his throat. From the opposite edge of the clearing, trees burst apart as a new creature crashed through, taller, heavier, faster. 2 powerful legs stomped the earth. Tiny, clawed arms jerked near a deep barrel-like chest. Its head was long, filled with sharp teeth, and its yellow eyes gleamed with predatory focus. An Allosaurus. Malone Sip's blood turned cold. It stood over 15 feet tall, and unlike the iguanodons, this one noticed them. It turned, it sniffed, and it let out a low, guttural bellow that seemed to shake the very leaves. "Run," Roxton shouted. The group scattered, diving into the ferns as the predator lunged forward. Malone's boot caught on a root, and he fell hard. The breath left his lungs. He rolled, expecting jaws to close on his neck, but the creature had gone after movement. Roxton fired once, twice, the bullets barely slowing the beast. It wasn't set hunting to feed. It was defending its territory. Or perhaps, playing. Malone scrambled to his feet and ran, crashing through the brush with Summerlee wheezing close behind. Branches whipped their faces. Something snapped behind them. A tree fell. The predator roared. They didn't stop running until the sounds faded into silence. They regrouped hours later, bruised, breathless, and shaken. They spoke little that night. The fire crackled, the shadows grew long, and no one slept easily. For now, the Allosaurus had left them alone, but its presence changed everything. This world wasn't just filled with life, it was ruled by it. Challenger still wore a look of ecstasy, but even he was quieter now. Summerlee, always skeptical, finally whispered, "It's set, real, all of it." Malone didn't write that night. He simply stared into the dark, his rifle across his knees, listening to the jungle breathe. They had made first contact, and the world they had entered was very much awake. Chapter 9: Predators of the Past. The jungle never stopped moving. After their encounter with the Allosaurus, the explorers changed everything. How they walked, how they camped, how they breathed. No longer was the plateau a wondrous curiosity. It was a hunting ground, and they were trespassers. Roxton took the lead now, always walking with his rifle ready, eyes scanning the underbrush like a soldier in enemy territory. Summerlee stopped lingering behind to examine ferns. Challenger, though still buzzing with manic pride, finally acknowledged the need for caution. And Malone, he began to understand fear not as a jolt or a moment, but as a constant presence, like the weight of a storm in the air that never breaks. The day after the attack, they found more signs: gouged tree trunks, broken foliage, nests trampled flat. Roxton identified massive claw marks on a stone outcrop. "This one's 6 big," he muttered. "Bigger than the one we saw yesterday. Look at the spread. 4 claws, wide gait. Could be a second Allosaurus or something worse." Summerlee adjusted his spectacles. "There are more?" "Predators travel solo," Roxton replied. "Territorial means we sept crossing from one hunting range to another." "And if they sep hunting?" Malone asked. Roxton glanced at him. "Then we sipped best not to be the easiest thing to catch." That afternoon, it got worse. They were cutting through dense brush when the sound struck them. A high, screeching call, shrill, avian, and close. Too close. Roxton froze. "Velociraptor," he whispered. Malone blinked. "That sip's real. Too real." Then came the second cry. Then the third. Triangulating, coordinating. Roxton turned to the others. "Don set run. Stay together. Keep your backs to each other." Challenger clutched his walking stick like a weapon. Summerlee had no weapon at all. Malone raised his rifle, heart pounding so hard it shook his aim. And then they came. Fast, low, blurs of motion in the undergrowth. Not the towering monsters of fossil exhibitions, but smaller, quicker nightmares. 6 feet long, feathered, with sickle-like claws and intelligent yellow eyes. They darted just at the edge of vision, testing the perimeter. Roxton fired at the first one that charged. It dropped with a screech, but 2 more emerged to replace it. Malone fired next, catching one in the flank. It screamed and fell into the ferns, writhing. The third came fast, too fast, leaping at Summerlee with a hiss. Malone tackled him out of the way as Roxton shot it in midair. Blood splattered the leaves. Then, silence. They waited, breathing hard, guns still up. Nothing moved. "Gone," Roxton said, or regrouping. Summerlee was pale as a sheet. That one nearly disemboweled me. "You're lucky Malone here knows how to dive," Roxton said. Malone swallowed hard. His hands were shaking, and his shirt was soaked with blood, but not his. They examined the creature Roxton had shot. Up close, it was horrifying. All muscle and claw, with intelligent eyes that seemed to remember things. "This one was testing us," Challenger muttered. "Probing, learning." Roxton nodded. "Pack hunters, scouting our strengths. Next time they sit'll strike harder. They don't set, quit." They left the carcass behind. It wasn't a trophy, it was a warning. That night, they doubled the fire and set up a ring of makeshift spears tied between trees. Zambo's voice came faintly from below the cliff once or twice, but they dared not return to the ledge. Roxton took first watch. Malone volunteered for second. He sat up under a sky choked with stars, the rifle across his lap, listening. Far off in the distance, a deep, reverberating roar echoed, followed by a silence so complete, it was deafening. Predators moved through the dark. Not one. Many. The jungle was alive. And it was hunting. They were no longer explorers. They were prey. Chapter 10. The Ape Men. The jungle changed. They first noticed it in the trees. Less undergrowth, more space between trunks. The canopy thinned, letting shafts of golden light pour down in broken columns. The air grew cooler, but the tension rose. It wasn't the relief of open space. It was the sensation of being watched. They moved slowly now, rifles always ready. After the raptor attack, and multiple near misses with prowling predators, their instincts had sharpened. But what approached them next was not a creature of tooth and claw. It was something else entirely. They came upon a series of crude stone markers, stacked cairns, arranged in rows, not natural, not random. Deliberate, Challenger said, crouching beside one. A signal, a boundary marker perhaps. Or a warning, Roxton muttered, hand resting on his revolver. Farther in they found crude totems, carved wooden poles with faces etched into them, not quite human, not quite animal. The faces were distorted, IP-like, but expressive twisted mouths, bulging eyes, elongated brows. Carving implies tools, Summerlee said. Tools imply culture, which implies people, Malone finished. Not people, Challenger corrected. Eyes narrowed. Something else. At dusk, they found the first body. A man, dark-skinned, tribal tattoos on his arms and chest. His limbs had been broken, his face battered. He had clearly been killed in a frenzy, but what struck them most was his expression. Terror. His eyes were still wide open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. No animal did this, Roxton said. They buried him in silence. That night, around the fire, the group sat closer than usual. Even Challenger didn't speak. A strange sound echoed through the trees. A rhythmic whoop whoop whoop, distant but insistent. Not an animal call. A chant. It was on the next morning that they saw one. A figure, crouched in a tree, half hidden behind vines. Malone spotted it first. Just a flash of black fur, the glint of dark eyes, and a hunched silhouette. He froze, raised his rifle, but didn't fire. "Look," he whispered. The others turned just as the figure moved, lithe, fast, and eerily human. It dropped to the ground, ran on all fours, then vanished into the brush with startling speed. They gave chase, but it was gone almost instantly. "What in God's name?" Summerlee began. Challenger stood perfectly still. Homo pungarades, the missing link, or perhaps something stranger still. Roxton grimaced. "Whatever it is, it can watch us, and it wants us to know it sends watching." Later that day, they stumbled into what could only be called a village, if the word even applied to what they saw. Crude huts made of sticks and bones, fire pits still smoldering, tools, shaped rocks, sharpened spears, strewn across the ground, and the bones, human bones. Dozens, scattered, cracked open, gnawed. Summerlee turned away, nearly retching. Roxton inspected one of the skulls. Clean breaks, jaw dislocated. This was butchery. Challenger examined a charred femur. They eat their dead, or their enemies. The realization settled over them like ash. They weren't yet alone on the plateau, and the dominant species might not be dinosaurs. They set camp far from the site, in a small hollow surrounded by high rocks. That night, the jungle came alive again. Shouts in the distance, drums, Real drums, pounding low and steady, shapes flickered in the darkness. Red eyes peered from the trees. Then something landed just outside the firelight with a heavy thud. Roxton spun, rifle raised. Malone stepped forward, cautiously. It was a bundle, wrapped in vines, inside a carved bone dagger, stained dark, and a tuft of human hair. A message. "We has been marked," Roxton said grimly. "We set been marked guessing anymore. They know we are set here." Challenger stood tall, beard bristling. "Then we self make contact, not with bullets, with diplomacy. These creatures, whatever they are, think. That means they can be reasoned with." Roxton narrowed his eyes, or outwitted. Malone didn't sleep that night. He sat with his rifle, watching the trees. Something watched him back. They had found the monsters, and they were wearing the faces of men. Chapter 11. The Human Tribe. They didn't expect to find people, not so deep in this alien world. Not after all the carnage, the feral cries in the dark, and the bone-strewn village of the ape men. Yet here they were, real people, human, unmistakably, and terrified. It began with a trap. Roxton, scouting ahead through thick underbrush, stumbled into a crude snare, just a vine loop hidden under leaves, but strong and clever. It yanked tight on his boot and sent him tumbling. The others rushed to help, rifles drawn, but before they could free him, they were surrounded. 10 figures emerged from the trees. Men, bare-chested, skin the color of old copper, adorned in feathers, bark fiber sashes, and paint, spears leveled, slings at the ready. But what stood out most was the fear in their eyes. Not fear of the explorers. Fear for them. One of them spoke, fast and clipped, in a dialect none of the explorers recognized, but gestures were universal. Follow, quiet, hurry. They obeyed. The journey took them deep into the jungle, up a narrow ravine choked with moss and vines. After an hour of scrambling over slick rock and ducking beneath low branches, they emerged into a hidden valley, a secret village nestled beneath stone cliffs. 100 eyes watched them from behind woven huts. Women, children, old men, all silent, all wide-eyed. The warriors herded the newcomers into a large open structure at the center of the village. There, seated on a carved wooden stool and cloaked in jaguar fur, was an older man with a face like weathered bark and eyes sharp with thought. The chief. Malone raised his hands. "We mean no harm." Roxton followed. "We were attacked by ape men. We ran. We don't sit know how to leave." The old man tilted his head, then spoke, slowly, in heavily accented Portuguese. "You are not the first who came from below." That made Challenger step forward, eyes wide. "Others, from outside." The chief nodded. "Years ago, men in strange clothes, like you, one stayed. He learned our tongue. He fought for us, until they took him." "Who?" Roxton asked. The old man's Sip's mouth thinned. The word needed no translation. Over the next several hours, the explorers were given food, roasted fruit, smoked meat, and a sweet root that calmed their nerves. The villagers told their story with gestures, broken Portuguese, and drawings in the dirt. The ape men ruled the plateau. They lived in the northern cliffs, in caves filled with bones. They stole from the humans, hunted them, enslaved them, ate them. Every few months they raided the village, took captives, left warnings, burned huts, mutilated bodies. Resistance had been tried, years ago. It had failed. Now the humans survived by hiding, moving, praying the beasts would not return. "They call them gods," the chief explained softly, "but we know better." Summerlee was pale, and the outsider, the man who stayed. The chief pointed to a hut on the far edge of the village. "Ask him yourself." The Mansit's name was Maple White, or rather, had been. His body was bent, hair gone to grey, skin weathered by years of jungle, but his eyes still sparked with intelligence when Malone approached him. You're from the world below?" White asked, voice hoarse. Malone nodded. "We read your journal, your sketches. We came to prove you were right." White gave a sad, crooked smile. "I was right, but I never expected rescue." "You cert coming with us," Malone said. "I can sit. I said I'm not who I was, but I can help you. I know the plateau. I know the beasts, and I know the paths. There are tunnels, hidden ways. Even the ape men don't know them all. Challenger leaned in. Can you help us find another route down? White nodded. Yes, but not until you help these people. You don't understand. This is no longer about science. This is about survival. Roxton agreed. We can leave them here to be hunted like dogs. If we stuck, we might as well make it count. Summerlee looked from face to face. You action an uprising. Challenger Sip's voice was iron. And suggesting we do what no man has dared. We fight back. The decision wasn't made lightly. The villagers were skeptical, frightened, but hope flickered behind their eyes. Roxton trained their best warriors in spear techniques and slingshot accuracy. Malone taught them how to set traps. Challenger helped fashion crude explosives using chemicals scavenged from jungle plants, and Summerlee begrudgingly served as a medic. Malone took notes furiously, but for the first time, he wasn't writing a report. He was writing history. At night, the drums of the ape men pounded in the north. But this time, the village did not huddle in silence. They sharpened their spears. They planned. They prepared. The humans of the plateau would no longer hide. They would rise. Chapter 12. The Uprising. They struck at dawn. The sky was still a soft bruise of violet and gold as the human tribe, led by the outsiders, emerged silently from the jungle's edge. Mist clung low to the ferns. Spears gleamed with dew. There were no chants, no war cries, just grim purpose. For too long, the ape men had hunted in the dark, dragging away children and warriors alike. Now the humans would return the terror. And this time, they were not alone. The plan had taken days to prepare. Lord Roxton had overseen every detail of the assault with the precision of a military officer. They would strike the ape men's main village, carved into the northern cliff face, where intelligence from Maple White and the villagers revealed their captives were kept. I want 2 spear groups moving on the flanks, Roxton had said, drawing maps in the dirt. Fire starters here, and the ambush party here. I lead the forward assault. Malone, you take rear coverage. Stay light, move fast. Malone had nodded, gripping the knife they'd fashioned for him from a jagged bone. It wasn't the pen he was used to wielding, but here, stories were written in blood and fire. Challenger and Summerlee, unfit for direct combat, remained behind to protect the village and prepare for medical care. Challenger, however, insisted on sending a final message. If any of us fall, he had said, let the world remember, this was not conquest, it was resistance. Now, as the warriors climbed the slick rock path toward the enemy camp, every rustle and branch crack sounded deafening, but the ape men, confident in their dominion, had grown careless. The humans reached the plateau's upper ridge without detection, and then Roxton gave the signal. A bird call, sharp, rising, then silence, then chaos. From the eastern slope came a wall of fire, smoke bombs made from resin and crushed roots, lit and hurled into the heart of the ape men's camp. The thick smoke disoriented them. They stumbled from their dens, coughing, howling, blind. That sips when the spears flew. Dozens, silent and deadly. Several ape men fell before they even saw their attackers. Roxton and the lead warriors stormed in, next driving into the chaos like a blade. The humans fought with the desperation of the oppressed. The ape men, powerful but disorganized, reeled in confusion. Malone advanced with a group on the northern flank, cutting down guards at the prisoner pens. Inside, huddled in filthy cages, were villagers taken months ago and one white man, bearded and battered. Gomez, Malone gasped. The traitorous guide. Gomez stared up at him, wild-eyed. They made me help them, said they sinned and let me live. Malone's eyes hardened. You picked the wrong gods. He turned away and broke the cages open. The freed prisoners stumbled into the light, weeping. 2 men grabbed spears and joined the fray without hesitation. The ape men began to regroup. Larger ones emerged, leaders, covered in painted mud and adorned in bones. They roared commands, rallying their kin. Roxton shouted to the second wave, now. From the cliff above, a line of slingers launched a hail of rocks, sharp, jagged and deadly. Several ape men fell, their skulls shattered. Then the final blow came. A firebomb, handcrafted by Challenger himself, was hurled into the largest stone hut. It erupted with a low thunderclap, sending debris into the sky. The ape men broke. Some fled into the forest, some fell to their knees, submitting, a few fought to the end. But by sunrise, the village belonged to the humans again. Silence settled over the battlefield. Smoke rose in curls. The dead lay strewn across the jungle floor, human and ape-man alike. Roxton wiped blood from his face, scanning for movement. Malone stood near the ruined cages, breathing hard. His arms ached, his legs were shaking, but he was still standing. They had done it. They had won. The surviving ape-men were bound, their weapons taken. The chief of the human tribe stood tall once more, adorned in feathers and paint, his voice rising in a chant of victory. Challenger and Summerlee arrived shortly after, leading a procession of villagers to reclaim their dead and tend the wounded. Challenger said nothing for a long time. He simply stared at the scene, eyes wide, not with horror but awe. Summerlee shook his head. History wants sick to believe this. Malone, bloodied and dirt-smeared, stepped forward. Then we still make sure it does. That night, a great fire was lit in the center of the human village. Songs were sung, dances performed. For the first time in years, the people felt joy instead of fear. Roxton sat with a carved mug of fermented fruit drink, polishing his rifle and watching the flames. "We did good today," he said softly. Malone nodded. It wasn't stet about discovery anymore. "No," Roxton replied. "It was about liberation." But even in victory, the question lingered. How would they get home? Maple White had promised knowledge of a way down, another path, hidden from view, buried in the stone. He would reveal it. But first, they would rest. And for one night, the lost world belonged not to monsters, but to men. Chapter 13, Secrets of the Plateau. The battle was over, but the plateau was far from understood. The days that followed the uprising brought something the explorers hadn't experienced since their arrival. Time. Time to look, not just survive. Time to ask questions. Time to learn. It was Roxton who said it first. "We've earned our peace. Now let's sit, earn the truth." Maple White, now walking with a staff and speaking more clearly each day, became their guide. He had spent years on the plateau, years watching, hiding, surviving, and what he knew was unlike anything found in books or maps. "The animals here, they don't sit behave like their fossils suggest," he told Malone during one of their walks. "Some live in herds, others roam alone. They sit adapted, evolved in ways no scientist down below would believe." "So this isn't set just a living past," Malone said, scribbling notes. "It sets a different present." On the second day of exploration, they reached a series of warm springs fed by a geothermic vent near the northern cliffs. Around the water's edge grew plants with enormous translucent leaves that shimmered when touched. Summerlee was nearly overcome with excitement, spending hours sketching, sampling, and muttering plant taxonomy under his breath. "These ferns," he said, holding up a leaf as wide as a man-sip's chest, aren't sit just ancient. They sit hybrids, a mingling of prehistoric and modern genera. As if the plateau encouraged fusion over extinction, Challenger beamed. "Exactly. This environment is a crucible sealed from time, but not frozen by it, a living laboratory." Later, Malone wandered alone and came across a clearing filled with dragonflies the size of sparrows, wings glittering like stained glass. They buzzed around him, unafraid. One even landed on his outstretched hand. In that moment, he forgot danger. He forgot fear. He felt small and lucky. They ventured deeper. Roxton led them toward a hidden lake, a great silver sheet nestled in a crater at the center of the plateau, surrounded by obsidian rock and towering, bent trees that looked like something out of mythology. The water was still and dark. At first it seemed lifeless. Then something massive broke the surface. A long, smooth neck, a humped back, a flash of serpentine movement. The creature vanished as quickly as it appeared. "A plesiosaur," Challenger whispered. "Frozen." "No," Summerlee corrected. "A descendant. Look at the neck length, the way it dove. It's sent as adapted. There's sent as intelligence in how it moved." Malone sat by the lake for hours that evening, hoping to see it again. He never did. But he dreamed of it that night, gliding beneath ancient waters, untouched by time, unseen by man. On the fourth day, they discovered the bones. A half-buried ravine revealed a fossil bed of astonishing density, hundreds, possibly thousands, of skeletons compressed over centuries. Challenger waded in knee-deep, hands trembling, brushing away centuries of dust with reverence. "This is a record," he said, "a timeline in stone. Some of these creatures never existed in our fossil record. They sit new, or lost before we learned to look," Summerlee said. They worked side by side for hours, not as rivals, but as scholars driven by the same flame. Even Roxton knelt in the dirt, examining a preserved skull that looked almost feline, but with 6 long eye sockets. Not every discovery brought understanding. Some deepened the mystery. At the edge of the plateau's western rim, Maple White led them to a ring of standing stones, tall, thin pillars set in a perfect circle. The stone was ancient, older than the forest that grew between them. "This wasn't set built by the ape men," Maple said. "They avoid it, and they never come near after dark." Malone stepped carefully into the circle, his skin prickling with something he couldn't name. "Who built it?" he asked. Maple shrugged. "I Sips wondered the same thing for 20 years. There were carvings on the stones, worn, obscure, impossibly old, spiral patterns, animal forms, human shapes with elongated arms reaching skyward. Somebody was here," Challenger murmured, "long before us, long before them." That evening, as they gathered around a fire, the tribe sang songs of memory, and the elders recited a story, the story of the first fire, when gods descended from the cliffs and tamed the beasts of the land. It was a myth, clearly. But even myths leave fingerprints. "We set not the first intruders here," Roxton said quietly. "Just the first with notebooks." Malone nodded, feeling the weight of everything they'd seen. The monsters, the people, the ruins, the silence between the trees. "The Seps more here than teeth and claws," he said. "This place has memory." That night, Malone wrote in his journal by firelight, "There are places in the world where time folds in on itself. This is one of them, not just because it is old, but because it refuses to be understood in modern terms. We have found a land that remembers everything, and in doing so, it is slowly making us forget the world we came from." But time was running short. Their supplies, even with the tribe's generosity, wouldn't last forever. They had knowledge, they had evidence, they had made peace. Now they needed a way out. Chapter 14, Finding a Way Out. They had witnessed wonders, survived horrors, and sparked a rebellion, but none of it would matter if they couldn't return to tell the tale. The plateau, for all its beauty and mystery, remained a prison. And time, though suspended in the jungle, moved relentlessly in their bones. Their food stores were thinning. Ammunition had been stretched dangerously thin. Even the adrenaline that had carried them through blood and fire was starting to fray. Muscles ached more. Nerves snapped faster. Malone put it plainly during a fireside meeting with Roxton, Challenger, Summerlee, and Maple White. "If we don't leave soon, we shall stop being explorers and start being ghosts." Maple White nodded slowly. "There is a way. I found it years ago. A tunnel, narrow, dangerous, and not easy to reach, but it leads to the base of the plateau." Roxton leaned forward. "Why haven't you used it before?" "I nearly died trying, and I had nowhere to return to." Maple Sip's voice dropped. "But you still have the world." Challenger stood, firelight catching in his eyes. "Then take us there, we will face any danger." White hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "We leave at dawn." The journey to the hidden tunnel took 2 days, westward through regions of the plateau they had never dared to explore. This was no longer just science, it was survival. The terrain changed again. Gone were the lush ferns and gentle clearings. Here the forest thinned into rough terrain, craggy outcrops, uneven ridges, fields of ankle-breaking volcanic stone. The air was drier, the sounds of life more distant. On the second day, they reached the edge of what Maple called the Dead Slope, a slanted basin of black rock leading to a jagged wall of stone. Near its base, the mouth of the tunnel. A narrow, misshapen fissure, no wider than a door and half hidden behind hanging moss. "That sits it?" Roxton asked. Maple nodded. "It goes deep, far deeper than the eye can follow. Then it angles down sharply. You still need ropes, light, and courage." "Those we have," Malone said, though his stomach twisted at the thought. They made camp near the entrance and prepared. Ropes were tested, torches were wrapped, notes were hidden and sealed inside watertight cylinders to be given to Zambo in case they didn't return. If the plateau claimed them, at least some part of their discovery might reach the world below. That night, around a small fire ringed by stone, the four men spoke little. There was nothing left to say. Malone sat awake long after the fire died, staring up at the stars, wondering if he would ever see them from a London rooftop again. The descent began at dawn. Zambo remained above with the tribe, charged with guarding the plateau's edge and waiting for a signal, 3 smoke plumes to indicate safe descent. The tunnel was immediately claustrophobic. The rock pressed in like a closing throat. The path dropped fast, curving deeper into the mountain's belly, lit only by the flickering yellow light of their torches. For hours, they climbed downward, lowering themselves by rope, navigating slippery slopes, stepping carefully across narrow ledges that vanished into darkness. They passed fossilized shells embedded in the rock, strange ancient carvings that even Challenger could not explain, and at one point, a half-buried skeleton, human, long dead, clutching a broken torch stick. Malone Sip's hands trembled as he stepped past it. "We sit not the first to try," he whispered. "Let's be the first to succeed," Roxton muttered. They lost track of time. The heat gave way to cool dampness. The air grew stale. Twice they nearly lost their footing on crumbling rock. Summerlee twisted his ankle and had to be supported by Challenger and Malone for hours. Then, just when it felt like the mountain would never end, they saw light. Not torchlight, sunlight. A faint golden gleam seeping through a wide vertical crack in the rock wall. Roxton shoved against it with his shoulder. The stone groaned, then split apart like a curtain. Beyond it, a steep slope of gravel and ferns, leading down into the jungle below. They had made it. They emerged into the open afternoon like men reborn. Birdsong filled the air, the jungle canopy swayed gently in the breeze, and far above them the red cliffs of the plateau loomed, no longer a mystery, but a memory. Malone fell to his knees and pressed his hands into the warm earth. Roxton just smiled and lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. Summerlee looked back at the mountain. "It feels like we're leaving Eden," he said. Challenger's voice was low and reverent. "We stumped not leaving it, we stumped bringing it back." They lit the signal fires. Hours later, Zambo came through the jungle, yelling with joy, carrying ropes and water, and most importantly, the journals. He had guarded everything, just as promised. They told him everything, and he listened without blinking. Then Challenger turned to Malone. "Now," he said, "you write. The world must know." Malone nodded. He had climbed into a lost world. Now he would carry it back down. Chapter Quince: Escape. The return journey down the Amazon was both a physical retreat and a mental unraveling. After weeks on the plateau, every footstep away from it felt like letting go of a dream, but it was also a fight for survival. Though they had escaped the ancient heights, the jungle below was no gentler. They were alive, but they were not safe. Zambo led them swiftly along jungle trails. The guides had abandoned weeks ago. He moved with silent efficiency, carving a safe path with his machete and always listening. He had waited loyally for their return, and now he carried more than their gear, he carried their truth. "We must move fast," he told Roxton. "Rain is coming. River will swell, and we Sep not alone out here." Roxton nodded. "We Sip survived worse." Malone said nothing. He just kept walking, notebook in his vest, the record of the impossible close to his chest. On the 3rd day of descent, the weather turned. Rain began as a whisper, then a hammering torrent that turned trails into rivers and rivers into walls of water. They were forced to shelter for 2 nights beneath an overhanging bluff, wrapping their equipment in tarps and keeping watch in shifts. Even in this return to so-called civilization, they remained haunted. Strange footprints were found around the camp one morning. 3 toes, clawed, a smaller cousin of the creatures above, or something else that had followed them down. They didn't wait to find out. The days blurred together. Canoes were salvaged, rivers were braved, and eventually the jungle began to thin, replaced by stretches of grassland, cultivated trees, and distant signs of human life, smoke rising in lazy tendrils from the first village they'd seen in over a month. By the time they reached the small outpost near Paran, the party looked like ghosts, dirty, gaunt, and sun-scarred, but their eyes were alive, burning. They carried crates wrapped in waterproof hide, inside samples, sketches, photographs, bones. the shriveled wing of a pterosaur, a claw the size of a butcher's knife, pressed leaves from plants no one had catalogued, the journals and Malone's writing. Proof. Word of their return spread quickly. The British consulate sent a wire to London. Challenger demanded urgent passage home. Summerlee insisted they secure a safe courier for the fossils. Roxton made it clear that no one was allowed to speak until they stood together before the Royal Zoological Institute. What we have seen, he said, will either make us legends or lunatics. We speak with one voice. And that voice would be heard soon. The voyage back to England was surreal. The SS Langham carried them swiftly north, slicing through waves as if dragging them back to the modern world. Malone spent much of the journey alone on deck, staring at the stars, trying to reconcile the world below with the one they had returned to. Challenger, never content with silence, reviewed notes obsessively. Summerlee grew more reclusive, poring over botanical samples and arguing with Challenger over the classification of flora from a forgotten epoch. Roxton polished his rifle, but seemed at peace for the first time in weeks. We did what needed doing, he told Malone one evening. Now the real battle begins, getting them to believe it. Malone nodded. I think I sit more afraid of the skeptics than the Allosaurus. Roxton grinned. You should be. When the ship docked in Southampton, there was no fanfare, no cheers, no band, no headlines. Just fog, cold wind, and the familiar smell of coal smoke drifting over the sea. But inside Malone's coat pocket was the first chapter of a book that would shake the world. He looked at the grey skyline of England and smiled faintly. Let them laugh. He had seen it, and soon so would they. Next stop, London. Next chapter, The Reckoning. Chapter 16, Back to Civilization. The train from Southampton to London was clean, polished and sterile, its rhythmic clatter on the tracks the first mechanical sound Malone had heard in months. The contrast was jarring. He sat beside Challenger, whose beard had been hastily trimmed, and who now wore a proper waistcoat again, though it barely contained the broadness of his chest. Roxton sat across from them, boot crossed over one knee, drowsing with the relaxed poise of a man who'd survived more than one war. Summerlee, quiet and pale, stared absently out the window at the rolling green fields as they flicked past, quaint, civilized and almost offensively normal. Only Malone wrote. His notebook was nearly full now, pages stained with sweat, dirt and ink. He wasn't crafting a story anymore. He was shaping a message, one that would bridge two worlds. A world of lectures, steam trains and telegraphs, and a world of roars, claws and silence. London greeted them with indifference. They stepped from the platform at Victoria Station, unrecognized, carrying their crates, their journals, and the weight of everything they had seen. A porter wrinkled his nose at the smell of their jungle-worn coats. I thought you were soldiers, he muttered. In a way we were, Roxton replied. McArdle was waiting for them at the Daily Gazette building, tapping his cane on the stone steps, eyes narrowing as Malone approached. Well, he said, taking in the torn satchel, the weathered face, the look in his reporter Sip's eyes. Either you Sip gone mad, or you Sip brought me the story of the century. Malone held out the journal. McArdle opened it, flipped through the first few pages, and stopped. Is this all real? It sits more than real, Malone said. It sits witnessed. McArdle exhaled. You didn't just write it, did you? You lived it. Malone smiled faintly and barely survived it. Within a day, the scientific community was in an uproar. Challenger wasted no time announcing a formal presentation at the Royal Zoological Institute. He sent telegrams. He sent threats. He sent printed invitations in red envelopes marked with the seal of the Challenger Foundation, an organization that didn't exist until that very morning. Roxton handled the logistics, securing guards for the specimen crates, verifying transport for the preserved samples, and ensuring that no leaks reached the press before the official unveiling. Summerlee, for his part, refused interviews. He worked in silence, cataloguing every leaf, bone and sketch, ensuring no one could dismiss what they had found with a sneer. Meanwhile, Malone Sip's article was prepped, not for tomorrow Sip's paper, but for history. A serialized account was arranged to begin the morning after the presentation, complete with photographs, maps, and the line that would soon be repeated in newspapers around the globe. There is a world atop the world, and it is not lost, it is waiting. Gladys Hungerton read about Malone's return in the paper 3 days later. She sent a note, a short one. "Edward, I've heard incredible things. Please visit when you are able. I'm so proud of you." He read the note in silence and folded it neatly away. He felt no thrill, no flutter of hope, only a strange, weightless emptiness. She had wanted a hero. He had become one, but he had left something behind in that jungle that no letter could mend. 2 nights before the presentation, the group gathered for dinner at Roxton's London club. They sat in a quiet, oak-panelled room, away from the din of talkative members. For a while, no one said much. "I don't think we're the same men who left London," Summerlee finally said. "We's not," Roxton agreed. "We came back with knowledge, but something of us stayed behind. Maybe that sets the price of finding something no one else has." Challenger raised his glass. "To what we found." Malone raised his. "To what it changed in us." They were back in civilization. But civilization didn't know what was coming. The truth was prepared, the proof was ready, and the eyes of the world were about to turn to 4 men who had climbed to the roof of the earth and brought back more than anyone dared imagine. The curtain was rising, and behind it waited a living past. Chapter 17. The Proof. The Royal Zoological Institute had never been so crowded. By early evening, a line stretched around the block. Scientists, skeptics, reporters, members of parliament, and socialites, all elbowing for entrance. Rumors had run wild since Challenger's announcement. Some expected a hoax, others a spectacle. A few quietly hoped for scandal, but none were prepared for the truth. Inside the great hall, rows of polished oak chairs faced a raised stage draped in red. Oil lamps flickered on the walls. At the center of the platform sat 4 wooden crates, sealed and bolted under guard. Professor Challenger stood before them, arms folded, beard immaculately combed, wearing a dark academic robe that made him look like an avenging bishop of science. Summerlee, beside him, held a thick sheaf of papers and several fossil samples. Roxton stood just behind, calm and unreadable, and in the crowd, Edward Malone waited, notebook in his lap, his hands steady. This was no longer an adventure, it was a reckoning. The moderator, an aging scholar with trembling hands, introduced them stiffly. "Professor Challenger has summoned us here under extraordinary claims. We are here to examine the evidence he presents and to determine whether it is science or fiction." The room quieted. Challenger stepped forward, eyes sweeping the audience. "You laughed at me," he said flatly, "mocked me, called me a fraud, a lunatic. You branded my first expedition as fantasy because it did not fit your worldview. Tonight, that changes." He gestured to the crates. "These are not models, not reconstructions. They are specimens, bones, photographs, and yes, a living being." Gasps. Summerlee stepped forward and began reading from their field report. The journey up the Amazon, the ascent of the plateau, the discovery of prehistoric life, the attack of the Allosaurus, the uprising against the ape men. Each word was met with murmurs, disbelief, and growing unease, until Challenger raised a hand and gave the signal. Roxton stepped behind the largest crate and pulled the lid free with a crack. Inside, swaddled in straw, was a metal cage. And inside the cage was movement. A blur of leathery wings, a sharp screech, a flash of amber eyes. A living pterodactyl. The room erupted. Some people screamed, others surged forward for a better look. One woman fainted. A man near the front dropped his spectacles and stared in mute disbelief. The creature, no larger than a turkey, beat its wings against the cage and hissed. It had talons, a sharp beak, and a membrane like dark parchment stretched between its limbs. It was alive, furious, real. "Gentlemen," Challenger said calmly, "I give you the past." It took 10 minutes to restore order. Summerlee unveiled the second crate, fossils, perfectly preserved, pulled from the plateau's ravine. Roxton displayed photographs of the standing stones, the ape men's dwellings, the ancient lake. Challenger read excerpts from Malone's field journal, then invited Malone himself to the podium. "I fetch not a scientist," Malone said. "I fetch a reporter. I deal in facts. And I tell you now, everything we wrote, everything we brought back, is real." He paused. "There sips a world on that plateau, untouched by time, and it isn't sipped just about creatures. It sips about what we sip forgotten. By the time the presentation ended, the room was a storm of questions, arguments, and applause. Even Challenger's old enemies stood in stunned silence. Some wept, others whispered the beginnings of books, theories, revolutions. The world, once certain of itself, now quivered on the edge of wonder. That night, Malone walked the city streets alone, avoiding the press swarms gathering near the Gazette office. The stars were out, calm and distant. He found himself on a bridge over the Thames, notebook in hand, staring at the reflection of the gaslights in the water. He had done what he set out to do. He had become unforgettable. But the world he had returned to felt smaller. The next morning, Zit's headlines exploded. Dinosaurs alive in South America. Zoologists stunned by shocking discovery. British expedition proves lost world is real. The world changed. And Malone watched it from the shadows. Because now, a different question stirred in him. If the past was real, if it lived, then what else lay waiting in the forgotten corners of the earth? And more importantly, should he go back? Chapter 18. A New Purpose. London moved on, as it always did. A week after the presentation, Professor Challenger was a household name. Scientific journals scrambled to reprint their report. Museums offered blank checks for access to the fossil samples. The Royal Society, once Challenger's harshest critic, now begged for a seat at the table. Roxton was invited to speak at military academies about tactical leadership in primitive warfare. Summerlee published a monograph titled Botanical Anachronisms of the Amazonian Plateau. It sold out in 3 days. And Edward Malone, he walked through the streets like a man who no longer belonged to the world he had returned to. He received invitations, dozens, banquets, lectures, interviews. Every newspaper editor in the city wanted his next article. Every drawing room hostess wanted him to tell the story of the plateau over wine and cigars. He declined almost all of them. He spent his days finalizing the serialized account for the Daily Gazette, and his nights in quiet cafes, writing letters to himself or reading his notes from the journey over and over. But he couldn't stay still. Something in him had shifted, something permanent. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, he finally visited Gladys Hungerton. She greeted him in the parlor with a bright smile, eyes wide with excitement. "Edward, you cert, different. And Sep's seen things," he said, smiling softly. "Things I never imagined, things no one back here could dream of." She laughed, touching his sleeve. "And now you Sip returned. And so famous, you Sip'll be a great editor now, one sit you. You can settle down, maybe write a book." "Oh, Edward, it sits just like I hoped." He tilted his head. "Is it?" She blinked. "Well, yes. I always said I wanted a man who could do something." "You did," he said gently, "and I've done it." Her smile faltered. "Then, what's Sip's wrong?" Malone looked out the rain-spattered window, the jungle still echoing in his ears. "I think I became the man you wanted, Gladys. But I not sure you the woman I was meant to become him for." She stared at him, silent. He stood. "I don't belong to this world anymore. At least, not the way I did." He left her there, the parlor growing smaller behind him with every step. Weeks passed. The newspapers moved on. Challenger began planning a second expedition, with university backing this time. Summerlee declined to return, citing health. Roxton wasn't sure. Malone didn't hesitate. His last article in the Gazette was not a report but a farewell. There are still places the maps don't show, still truths too large for the world to swallow. If I vanish again, it is not because I am lost. It is because I have found something, and I must follow it. On the morning of his departure, Malone visited the British Museum. He stood before the great fossil display, filled with creatures long dead. Children pressed their faces to the glass. A docent whispered facts to tourists. He smiled. Then he turned, coat collar up against the wind, and stepped out into the grey London morning. Not looking back. At the docks, Roxton was waiting, leaning on a crate. "Packed light?" he asked. "Packed right," Malone replied. They boarded the ship together, heading back to the mouth of the Amazon, back toward danger, toward discovery, toward the unspoken truth that some men aren't meant to settle. They meant to seek. As the ship cut through the waves and the English coast faded behind them, Malone pulled out a fresh notebook. On the first page he wrote, "Not the end, only the edge of the world." And beneath that, in smaller letters, "A new purpose begins where the old one ends." He capped his pen, smiled, and watched the horizon, where adventure was always waiting. The end. Thanks for spending this quiet time with me here at Sweet Dreams Storytelling. I hope you're feeling relaxed, peaceful, and ready for a restful sleep. As we say goodnight, let the calm background music guide you gently into dreamland. Before you go, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and until next time, rest well.